And here we go. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I am doing all right. Apologies for the sirens in the background. This is New York City after all.
Oh, New York.
Ugh, I know, right? Alrighty. So, thank you so much for coming back and talking with me again on this lovely Tuesday.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. Let's talk about class. What were your first takeaways?
Um, at first I thought this chapter was a lot like chapter 8 where he talks about behavior. It was just a lot of me learning. I didn't take a lot of notes. I didn't have a lot of epiphanies of, oh, this reminds me of this. It was a lot of learning this chapter. What
Yeah.
about you?
Um, Actually, whenever I've had a little bit more of a context of classism, not necessarily the intersection of classism and racism,
Mm.
but there was a ton of classism in my home community growing up. Um, the way that my dad described it was the haves and the have-nots.
Mhm.
Like the way that the way that I was taught about poverty, it didn't have a racial element to it. It mostly talked about classism.
Okay.
And there was never a why as to why are there haves and have nots and can there be another thing. It was just a universal truth generally acknowledged.
Yeah.
So I, of course, grew up in the haves,
Mhm.
not with the have nots.
Mhm.
So it was really interesting. Um, like there were two intermediate schools. One was called River Valley, and the other was called Woodgate. And they called the nicknames for those schools were Richer Valley and Hoodgate.
Wow. Okay.
So I would have actually grown up going. I went to private school through the years I would have been at those schools, but I would have gone to Woodgate um, just because the area that I was living in. But I grew up being friends with kids that went to River Valley. So that's a little bit of my background. What about you?
I've definitely heard the have and have not terminology. Actually, Tyler Perry has a show. It's more of like a soap opera on called The Have and the Have Not.
Mm,
But uh I feel like I've been both. You know, we didn't have a ton of disposable income as a kid, so more so have nots. All needs were met. So, shout out to my parents. But now it's this interesting halves situation where we definitely are extremely fortunate. So
mhm.
both sides of it but I feel like when I was a kid I would have said in the middle, like
Yeah. Like, do as kids, do we even have like a concept of what middle class is?
I don't think so. I remember our social work professor saying that one big problem about our society is everyone thinks they're middle class.
Yeah. But like what's also interesting is that like some of my best friends in college, like I would talk about like my parents taking me to Disney World and things that I was able to do kind of has as a halves, but it also could have been partially because I'm an only child and my parents only had me for child expenses. Um and they were like, vacation, what is vacation? And I was just like, oh, it's a thing that we did every summer. And they were like, but we both considered ourselves within the middle class. So like classism for sure is its own nuanced thing that I don't think I fully have a grip on.
Yeah. I think that's a fair evaluation. I'm trying to think. I feel most anytime anyone's asked anything about class, I hear middle class
Hmm.
across the board. And we've all had very different experiences.
Like I don't even know what, like we hear about these definitions like the poverty line, welfare, but like what necessarily, like class is it's a construct, first of all. Second of all, like how do we have a uniform definition of it to be even begin to take apart classism with the intersection of racism?
Yeah.
Ugh, my brain hurts already.
I was listening to Balanced Black Girl, and they were talking about the difference between rural and urban poverty. And
Mm-hmm.
I like had never heard of that before, but I mean, even within that, the difference between the two forms of poverty is quite appalling, actually.
Yeah. There are definitely things that I would say people who are rural impoverished versus impoverished in urban settings, like there's just a lot more resources available to those in urban settings. In my undergrad, they actually did have a social work in rural settings class.
Wow.
And so that was for people who might like live out in the country, not have any transportation, might not have running water or things like that. And they just talked about that in the context of, this is also America.
Mhm.
So we're just like, it's so interesting to think that for a lot of what I think globally, what people think about of America is they think about New York City and they think about like lush wealth and all of this, but rural poverty, like thinking about like the photos that by like Dorothea Dix,
Yeah.
the one who took photos during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. I think a lot of people don't really take into account like rural poverty.
And I think that's intentional to keep up the facade of what America is, because all America is like New York.
Yeah, obviously. Obviously. Um, so what did you think about the term white flight? Have you ever heard of it?
Yes, I have heard of it. Um, I think he does a great job of explaining
Yeah.
that, okay, so Black people are very limited because of racist real estate practices and housing policies. They're limited to specific people because they're attached to a specific class just automatically because of the color of their skin. And then white people they have the opportunity to leave. So white flight, and then you label that neighborhood because it's mostly Black and brown people. Yeah, I have heard of white flight.
Like
You?
I usually hear white flight in the context also of redlining,
Mm-hmm.
where developers will specifically go around specifically go around specific, will intentionally go around specific areas and draw red lines through a city, which is also a racist policy,
Yeah.
based on the populations that live there. There is actually I forgot where it was, but I'm going to show it to you. It's a dot map and it's a racial data dot map that like every single census person. So whenever you fill out the census, you fill out racial information.
Mm-hmm.
So the map online, I think it has the 2010 census. So I'd be interested to see the 2021. But every dot represents a person and it shows every race and like where specific races live. And if you look up my hometown, it looks like a freaking peace sign. Like it is like that divided by race. And like a lot of the neighborhood where I grew up and where my friends grew up 100% is a result of white flight. Like you can still see the legacy of that in Waco, Texas. And so it's really interesting to see how like Kendi talks about these policies in historical context, but also like it completely is relevant and still affects even our lives today. Like, and like I said, Kendi's not that much older than us.
No.
So,
Yeah, it's terrifying.
yeah. But it was interesting to see how Kendi was like, yeah, grad school. I moved to Philly.
Yes, that was extremely interesting to me that he thought that the real Black experience was impoverished, the impoverished experience. And did he say the hood? That's what, okay, I consider poor Blacks to be the truest and most authentic representatives of Black people. And this is an extremely educated Black man who believed this. And I mean, I think that's the shocking part that keeps like hitting me in the face every time, every chapter. It's the things that like even we believe about ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I think it's interesting to see and slash say that like a big part of the Asian American experience is that we're a lot of times excluded from these narratives. Like whenever people talk about racist housing policies and redlining and immigration quotas, I almost never think of Asians.
Mm.
So in that context, like I'm wondering like where did Asian people come in here, because I'm seeing Kendi talk about Latinx people, talking about Black people, but I see natives,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm very interested in what Asian data there might be, because
Right.
yeah, even though I did not grow up with that typical Asian experience, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I don't think he's mentioned maybe even one mention so far. Yeah.
Historical erasure, yay. It's just crazy to me and incredible that even in like leading books about how to be an anti-racist that Asians are not in the picture.
Yeah.
It's really sad too.
Yeah.
Been having a little low key of a sad day. So, but yeah, so what I have learned from like my own networks is that like Asian class disparity is one of the biggest gaps between all of the races. So if
Really?
you look at the highest paid Asians versus the lowest paid Asians, we have the biggest gap.
Huh. That is really interesting.
Because whenever you think about it, a lot of people think Asian immigrants and you think of doctors, engineers, and people like that. But we also have a lot of people that come and work in salons and um, work in the service industry and have restaurants and things like that, and things that you would necessarily think of as a lower class type of a job. So seeing the disparity between that, and then whenever movies like Crazy Rich Asians comes out,
Mhm.
it's such an interesting juxtaposition for me to see, honestly.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Were there any, like Kendi thought that the true authentic Black experience was an impoverished experience? Was there anything that maybe you believe, any type of myth or lie?
See, I don't know what I believe in terms of the true Asian experience, because I feel like I was excluded from that,
Okay.
being raised by white people as a Chinese adoptee. I feel like a lot of what I thought of the Asian American experience was probably something along the lines of probably some pretty racist ideals that
Mhm.
I'm thinking. I didn't think Crazy Rich Asians, whenever I was thinking of Asians growing up, I thought about restaurant workers and nail salons is a big one that I thought about. Um, and the kids that I met at violin lessons. Because all the Asians were in orchestra, lol. JK.
It's interesting. I had a friend from Vietnam who she was saying that, like, she was in college with me. Her family was still in Vietnam, and she was like, they were thinking about coming to the States, but she didn't want them to do that because then they would have to, like, they were doctors and they were really well off in Vietnam, and they would have to come and work in salons. And that was just so interesting to me that that prestige wouldn't travel with them.
Yeah. It's so interesting because like immigration in general, like whenever we think about the refugee population, when we think about just the immigrant population in the US, I one time met during one of my jobs where I was working in a local library for a summer gig, and one of the floor supervisors overheard a mother speaking Spanish to their child, and the floor supervisor very loudly just went, "Why can't they just learn English?" The mom turned around and says, "I actually have a PhD in biology, in like molecular biology. I just want my child to be bilingual." And I was just like sitting over there stacking books going,
Oh snap. That is, oh man, oh, that is awful.
so thinking that all immigrants are like trying to learn English or quote unquote poor, like it's such a that is another classist and racist idea.
Yes.
I feel like a lot of classism just really coincides with racism. Like you can't separate racism out of classism, especially in America.
And I really appreciate how Kendi just dove into that. Classism is racism. Capitalism is racism. And I already didn't like capitalism. So the fact that he connected those, it's like, I knew I didn't like it for a reason.
Like when we think about, I mean, it's hard to think about capitalism being racism whenever we're only raised on capitalism.
Right.
But when we think about it, like where did America draw its wealth? Slavery.
Yep.
What is America's big thing that makes it America? Capitalism.
And it's interesting because Elizabeth Warren, I didn't realize she was such a big capitalist fan. And she's like, oh, well, what did she say? Robbery is not capitalism. But I literally wrote down in my notes, I don't know any other way that capitalism works. It is nasty. And that's the only way I've seen it. Maybe I don't even think I'm missing it. I don't think there's a good form of capitalism out there.
And it's so interesting. Call me an idealist, but like I'm just like I'm looking at other societies and seeing like the better welfare of their populations in general. Like I look at like the Nordic countries, but they also have smaller population. The arguments that I always get whenever someone's like, "Oh, you don't like capitalism?" and I'm like, "Well, it's super exploitive and it kills people, so I'm kind of a fan of people not dying."
You know, I really appreciate that about you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I would hope that it's one of my more decent qualities. But they'll be like, capitalism is the only way because no other country is trying to do what the US is trying to do. And I was like, "What? Kill everyone in mass?" Speaking of which, I just also want to acknowledge that there was another police murder this week. I feel like we're talking about another one every single week, and this time it was a 13-year-old.
Yeah. Literally every week. So heartbreaking.
It's been a rough week. And like consistently seeing this and having to process it all anew while the Chauvin trial is going on. Last week I definitely called it the George Floyd trial, which it should not be because he's not the one on trial. It's his murder.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's hard. It's hard to be anti-capitalist in a society where capitalism and racism is so deeply ingrained.
And people aren't open to changing, even though capitalism has proven to be terrible in every form of the way. It's so interesting to me. That's one of the arguments about changing education, is that it's so deeply ingrained in our society. People just aren't even open to change, but like our education system isn't doing what it's supposed to do. So somebody needs to be open to change.
Like, the fact that the US is a world power and we're just making all of these mistakes, but it's kind of like the blind leading the blind here, you know, which I'm curious if that was an ableist comment that I just made. I'm not having a good day.
It's a good point. I've never even thought about that phrase until you just said it. Yeah.
It's not been a good week for me. Just between everything going on in the world and just life in general, it's been pretty sad.
Yeah.
So, like, talking about class, anti-capitalist, because conservative defenders of capitalism regularly say that their liberal and socialist opponents are against capitalism. I know several liberals that are pro-capitalism.
Really?
I think so. I think a lot of our liberal politicians that aren't like not the squad are willing to consider capitalism a necessary evil.
Is Elizabeth Warren a liberal? Would you consider her one?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't see any other politicians really fighting capitalism. I mean, AOC, she goes out as a democratic socialist.
Yeah. She's doing the work.
Right. Which also, he said socialism does not automatically mean anti-racist, and that blew my mind. I never even, I was like, okay, socialism is the key. Let's get there. And he was like, that is not necessarily anti-racist. And I'm like, wait a second.
I want to hear more of this. Keep going.
I looked into it. I couldn't find much. I did find an article about a liberal professor who was not, he was trying to talk at the Democratic Socialists of America New York chapter, and everything happened with Corona. And then people got upset that he was invited because he's one of these people who thinks that we should focus less on race and more on class. Because he said it's a more unifying thing, class, if we get all middle, lower class people together and like show that our rights are being infringed upon, as opposed to sticking to race, because he says, or the theory is that that's more isolating. Which, do you have thoughts of that initially? I have many thoughts.
Race is a very divisive and triggering word. And unfortunately, sometimes people just need to, you know, deal with it, and they just need to get over themselves and realize that race it's not a thing to be swept under the rug. It's not something that we are in a post-racial society. It is not something that we don't talk about. It's something that needs to be talked about. And I personally don't think that in the US, I personally don't think that you can separate racism and classism. I just don't.
I don't think so either.
So what are your thoughts? That you have many thoughts.
So many. I have so many thoughts. I understand race is seen as a divisive issue. But if we put aside race, like there are things that are specific to race, that are race specific to what people deal with and what people encounter and their perspective on life. So if we put that aside, to me, that's asking people to give something up in the name of unity. But like, is it really unity if I can't talk about my struggles as a Black person? And then, so the worry is that people are going to be divided. So like, are those people we really want united if they're not going to understand the struggles that like different racial groups deal with?
It's people mistaking peace with quiet,
Mm,
you
yeah,
know?
that is it.
It is people mistaking peace with quiet because, like, for example, in my own home, we are always having fun spirited debates. And my dad is oftentimes labeling himself as peacekeeper, peacekeeper. And I'm like, well, we're not resolving anything. You're just telling me and mom to stop arguing and to be quiet. That
Mm,
is quiet. That is not a resolution. Of course, me and my mom are going to get back at it like maybe like 2 hours later behind his back. But
right. Because I mean, what they're asking you to give up feels hypocritical.
like
Like,
it's not going to solve anything.
mm-mm,
You're just glossing over a major factor of classism.
mm-hmm.
Like you can't I genuinely do not believe you can separate the two.
No, because I mean, it's been determined since like the beginning of this country that the haves are white people and the have-nots are Black and brown people. And our classist system and our capitalism is built on that. So I agree. I don't think there's any way you can separate it.
Whenever whenever white people try to play the devil's advocate and talk about the poor whites
Mm,
and quote unquote white trash and trailer parks, like what does that evoke in you
mm, oh,
when people try to do, I'm going to play the devil's advocate because there are poor white people too.
it's just like, okay, yes, they're poor white people, but when you look at white people, they get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to loans, when it comes to housing, when it comes to everything. And nobody else gets that benefit. You look at, I remember reading Case for Reparations, which was a part of Justice in June, which I recommend. I will leave the link. It was amazing. And they were talking about how white people could get housing anywhere, regardless of their income, regardless of like, it was just based on their race. Black people could only get it for one place if they even got it. And then they were like they were preyed. They were the prey. They were
Preyed
victims
on.
of predators. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
so, okay, yeah, they're poor white people, but the problem, it's not really a problem because I feel like it should be more universal. The treatment of white people is that it doesn't matter realistically what class you're in because you're going to be treated like
Mm-hmm.
maybe you're a rich white person. Nobody else gets that benefit.
Exactly. Exactly. So, like, that is just such a hard conversation to have with middle and lower class white people because I don't know, like, what they want to shift blame on anymore, but it's also a capitalist idea to say that you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and any sort of objective failure is your own fault. I'm still learning that myself, and that is such an ingrained capitalist idea, and as we have already drawn that conclusion, capitalism is a classist, racist construct.
Yes.
So how do we even start to unroot that? That is talking about the very foundations of our society, not even modern society. We're talking about all of US history,
Mm-hmm.
like
I
the textbook and just throw it.
let's burn it because it probably doesn't even teach you history in the correct way at all. I really don't even know because like I know capitalists, people who love capitalism, and we can't even have a discussion. So I have no idea how we can transition to more equitable. Because I mean, if I tell my capitalist people who love it, I'm like, okay, that's racist. It's anti-black, it's anti-black and brown people, it's anti-women, like at its core, then they're gonna be like, no, but, and then have like so many different arguments. And I mean, it's like, I can't say anything more. It's anti-Black, it's anti-women, it's anti-brown.
Whenever people have the argument that capitalism creates innovation, it doesn't. It create capitalism competition. It doesn't create that. It creates opportunity for exploitation, is what it creates.
Yeah.
Because multiple people can have a good idea, and if you want everyone to have a good idea and say it improves society for the better, you don't put a freaking copyright or what is it, a patent
Mm-hmm.
on something. Like, for example, let's talk about insulin.
Yeah.
That is something that people need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And because of pharmaceutical companies deciding that that value, they can make money off of it,
Mm-hmm.
that is driving people into medical debt
Yeah, it's
to
disgusting.
keep breathing.
Mm-hmm. And then at the start of the pandemic, they lowered the prices. I remember that. And then they were like, so you could have done this whole time. I remember my econ professor said precisely that the argument for capitalism and an open market is that it drives competition. But when we talk about pharmaceuticals, we pay in our taxes, we pay for that. And then you turn it around and we have to pay, I mean, hundreds of dollars for like insulin, things that you need to live a quality life. It's disgusting.
It really is. So, to wrap this up, classism, capitalism, racism.
They are all the same word, just in different forms.
It's a
How,
fun thing. It's all a triangle.
how are you feeling, Hannah? How are you feeling after this discussion?
Honestly, despite how bleak it was, much better.
There's nothing like nothing like dishing capitalism. That just made me feel
It's also wonderful to see you every week.
yes. I hope you have a better week this week, but it's always a pleasure. I love these conversations.
Me too. Thank you. So next week we are talking about space.
Mm.
Ooh, love space. I love
Space,
taking up space.
it is the best.
All right. I will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.